that was their first studio, not studio, their first late major label album. Is that right?
Yeah, that was on London.
So how did
London.
you end up getting connected with that, and what was the sensibility with the Meat Puppets that?
Well, um, oddly enough, when I don't we didn't Dwight and I we didn't have it we weren't on Warner Brothers, but we were making noise around on the scene during the cowpunk scene, and we got an opportunity to open for the Meat Puppets at McCabe's. Have you been to McCabe's?
Of course, I love it.
Okay,
Yeah, of
so I mean everything about that is an odd juxtaposition in that the Meat
course.
Puppets are psychedelic desert dweller, pot smokers, acid droppers, and Dwight's a honky tonker from the valley, and we play McCabe's, which is the ultimate folk church. I mean, the most unnerving thing about McCabe's is that when you play it, it is when you stop playing and they stop applauding, it is the quietest. It's unnervingly quiet. You're like, oh my God. And if you just talk in a small voice, everybody can hear you. It's like, God, they're all staring at me. There's no glasses clinking. There's no chairs moving. It's just it's church, and so it's something to get used to. So we opened for the Meat Puppets at. We also opened for Bill Monroe
Oh
at
wow,
McCabe's.
that's
That was
beautiful.
huge. But we opened for the Meat Puppets, and I remember Derek, the drummer, was sitting in the lobby and he had their merch table out. And we didn't know, we had not met any of them. They didn't know us or anything. And they were from Phoenix and this, so they kind of probably thought we were like redneck cowboys, like we were going to give them a hard time because they had that in their life growing up in Phoenix. And Derek, and I started looking at Derek at the merch, the Meat Puppets merch. And they have a record called Up on the Sun.
Yeah,
Now, as a record producer, artistic kid, whatever, attracted to songwriters and songwriting, the concept of writing a song about Up on the Sun is brilliant. It's like, what? How do you put those two things together? How do you even remotely, in your wildest sci-fi Bradbury dream, put living on the sun? And I asked him about it, and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's about living on the sun." I was like, and I mean that they won. I was like, "Oh my God, that's amazing." He goes, "I bet you hate us, don't you?" And I said, "No, I think this is really good." I said, "Who drew this?" And they would sit around and smoke pot and draw, and they would draw monsters, and they all would draw, all of them, and they'd make these elaborate drawings, and then they'd pick which ones were posters and which one was the album cover and which one they'd put on the wall. And so I said, no, it's brilliant. And so that was my first kind of uh, introduction to the Meat Puppets because I'd heard of their name, and I just assumed that they were like a not very good punk band. So I had never heard them. And then when they played, I heard some of their songs, and they had like surf beats, and they weren't like super loud. The music was interesting. It was innocent and it was artistic, but it had a definite quality to it. So I just put that in the back of my head. Anyway, Dwight record comes out, we get successful. I make records. I become a successful producer. I get a producer manager who actually lived in New York. And so I would go to New York and he would take me around to the record companies and introduce me to the A&R guys to say, "What have you signed lately? Pete would like to listen to it. He might want to produce it if you thought it was a good fit." And he was sort of an agent, but that's how it worked. So there was a guy named Peter Kupke, a German, um, working at London Records with a girl. I think her name was Lori Harbaugh. I'm not sure that we knew. We said, we want you to go over there because we're going to do a Hank Williams Sr. tribute record. Like everyone was going to do a Hank Williams Sr. song. And they wanted to know if I wanted to produce it because Dwight's success, that was all country. So I was like, okay. So I went over to have the meeting and they were talking about the record and what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. What did I think and all that stuff. And Peter Kupke comes in, we're talking, and he left the room and he came back and he goes, "Oh, yes, I just signed the Meat Puppets. You wouldn't wanna do a Meat Puppets record, would you?" And he was joking because I was Pete Anderson, quote, unquote,
Yeah.
"country producer" talking about Hank Williams, and he said, "We just signed the Meat Puppets. You wouldn't wanna do a Meat Puppets record." I went, "The Meat Puppets?" I said, "I would love to do a Meat Puppets record." Now, the thread that runs through all of this stuff, whether it's Dwight, Michelle Shock, Meat Puppets, anybody, not Orbison or Jackson Brown or those people, but any of these other people, is they're songwriters. So the instrumentation is just window dressing. It's all about the song.
Yeah.
And Curt Kirkwood is a genius songwriter, which I found out later, but I was enthralled by their creativity. So I said, "Absolutely, man, those guys are great." And he was shocked. He was like, and he said, "I've only got $80,000, which in reality was not very much to make a record back then.
Right.
That was usually you'd go in with a brand new band and you could get 120 to 150 to make a record. And that would be to pay me and pay everybody and, get the record done." He said, "I've only got 80,000." I was like, and to me, I didn't care. I was like, "Yeah, man, I'd love to." So he was sort of like, "Okay." So we started the Hank Senior thing fizzled away. Left the meeting. He said, "I'll set it up so you fly over to Phoenix and meet them." So I said, "Okay." So I flew over to Phoenix. They were rented some house. I had lived in Phoenix in the late 60s when my mother retired from the auto industry. I was 20, I was 21 in Phoenix actually, and I was just starting to have bands. So I knew Phoenix somewhat, and it's a bizarre place, and it's a pop-up in the desert, it's how to explain it. So I went over there and I kind of understood their life, air conditioning, stay in the house, smoke pot all day, don't go out until the sun goes down. And and it's a beautiful place because it's in the middle of the desert, but it's totally spiritual and psychedelic. So I went to this house they had rented and they were living there and they were drawing pictures and they had a drum set up and they said, "Oh, we're going to do a gig tomorrow night at a parking lot." And they were popular. They had made maybe 3 or 4 records by then.
For SST, I think. Really good
SST,
records.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. And the funny thing is the way they judged the records they made for SST was what drugs they were on. They said, "Oh, that one? We took LSD for 3 days and made that record in 3 days." I was like, "Okay." Some were on peyote, mushrooms, weed, no hard narcotics, but some
All
whacked
psychedelic.
out
Yeah.
deal.
Sure.
And they judged the records by the psychedelics they were on. So they said, "We're going to this parking lot and we're playing a gig." And it was a big deal. I mean, a lot of people showed up because they were the Meat Puppets and
Yeah.
they were pretty well known at the time. So for whatever reason, Curt and his brother Cris, they were just fighting constantly. And Curt's the big brother. Cris decided to wear a dress and a wig to the gig. And I was with them and said, "Come on, Pete's here. We're going in the green room, the backstage." And it was at some store in a parking lot, whatever. And he walked in with his stuff on and Kurt's like, "What are you doing?" And Curt was like, even though the music is so psychedelic and so out, Curt is like normal. He's in his world, he's normal. He's like, "What?" He looked at his brother like, "What are you doing?" He was just dismayed. I can't remember if he compromised and took the wig off or the dress off, whatever. They went out and played, and we agreed to. They were like, "Yeah, you want to make a record? Cool, let's make a record." So I sort of brought them into my world, which was a really good studio with a really good engineer, and we didn't need musicians. Although I brought in, I think Skip Edwards played keyboards. It's been a while. I think I brought him in to play organ, and I brought Alex Acuna. Now,
Yeah.
Alex Acuna is a very well-known percussionist,
Right.
Latin percussionist, and I think his son was the drummer for Paul McCartney.
Yeah. I think Alex, he plays with Chicago currently, or
He
has.
might. I mean, he's got to be my age. I don't know what he's doing, but that said, famous.
Yeah.
So I brought him in, and I brought Skip in, and so Alex got there, and I don't smoke weed. Okay, I quit smoking weed 100 years ago. And so they were like, to them, smoking weed was like base level. So they they got Alex Acuna high, and he played percussion on the record. And every time I would run into Alex Acuna after that, he goes, "Where are those meat puppet guys, man? They had the best weed I've ever smoked. Where are they? Let's do another record with them." It's really funny. And I didn't even know that they'd blasted him off in outer space. So we did it at Capitol, and I'm very proud of the record. I'm
That's a
extremely
great
proud of the
record.
record. And all I did was make sure they were in tune and edit them. I was like an editor. It was like, okay, we don't need a 142 bar guitar solo. We need 16 bars.
Yeah.
So do your best. Let's hang out. Let's get you happy. And Curt's a psychedelic kind of, he's a movie groovy kind of cat. And he he acquiesced to that, and I'm so proud of the record. I really love the record. They played great. Um, and Curt and I was in awe of Curt's talent, and we've remained friends.
Yeah, you guys did an album together.
I did one for
With,
Little Dog.
yeah, and that
He's
was
a
a great
genius.
record y'all did. I
Yeah,
like that one
Snow.
too.
Snow.
Yeah,
He's a genius. He's a
yeah,
genius. I asked him about songwriting. I didn't want to quiz him too much, but I was just like, what are you thinking, man? In a good way. And he said, I just use words that I like the sound of. And it's like, you win. That answer wins. You, that's a sign of brilliance.
yeah,
Okay. You're not accepting any laws of common sense, nature, or literature. You're just like, I like the phonics. I like how this phonics works. It's like, okay. Because you think of like uh, Nirvana,
yeah,
Kurt Cobain, My Libido, My Mosquito, that one, he
yeah,
was a big fan of Kurt's. And
yeah,
he wrote those verses are so influenced by Curt Kirkwood.
yeah, yeah.
Just
Well, the Nirvana, obviously, I've got that record right here, unplugged.
oh yeah, they're on there.
Cobain, yeah, covered three songs. That was my introduction to the Meat Puppets, and I think probably for a lot of people of my generation, that was the introduction in a
He
really cool
said
way.
Kurt said he made more money off that record than all the records they ever did combined off of
Yeah,
those three songs of their royalties. So I'm really glad for them. They play. I ran into them on the road a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago. They were playing. They were amazing. They did the Sloop John B. by the Beach Boys. Just just killed it. Just
yeah,
buried it. Um,
yeah, super cool.
so I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. It's in my own from my own perspective, it's definitely a feather in my cap when people talk about producing records and or your versatility.
Yeah,
But it's all about songwriting. So in one way, it's like you produced Dwight Yoakam and the Meat Puppets. That's such a stretch, but it's not because it's only concern. All I'm concerned with are the songs.
yeah,
If the guitar is distorted or it's loud or this or that, that has no bearing on it. It's the arrangement of the songs.